my name is Beck, and if you've been on my channel for a while, you know that my favourite genre is fantasy. If you haven't seen my videos before, welcome. This is me trying to convince you that you should try fantasy, because I'm convinced that if you know your reading taste, you can pick out the things in a blurb that you like, and therefore you can jump into a genre and find things that you'll love. But if you don't really know the genre, then you don't really know how to do that. So I'm going to spotlight a few things that might help you do that. So let's get into them. Naturally, fantasy has a ton of subgenres and categories and a whole ton of detail. So I'm going to sum up a couple. And so one of them is high fantasy, and that is a category where fantasy books create an entirely new world. So there is basically nothing that's relatable to our world in that creation. It's kind of like The Witcher or Game of Thrones. They're completely removed from what we know. Then there's urban fantasy, which is generally related to something that we have an experience in. So for example, the Dresden Files, that is about a wizard detective. There is magic and mayhem in that series, but it's also set in Chicago. There are real world police in there, and there are human beings as well, obviously. So it is an urban fantasy where fantastical elements play into it, but it's also got an element of relatability with its location. So that is what urban fantasy is, and it also links into paranormal or supernatural fantasy. So supernatural fantasy often has potentially a human protagonist, but not all the time, and that is when there are supernatural monsters and creatures and magic. Often, like Vampire Diaries, there are vampires and werewolves and stuff like that. Additionally, there is also portal fantasy, and portal fantasy is probably very well known in Narnia, where the characters literally go through a doorway and then they're in a fantastical world. Another book that does this is Every Heart a Doorway, where kids go through magical doorways to worlds that suit them to a T, and then they come back and they kind of have to re-assimilate. So that plays with the Narnia idea in general. And you could also probably class Harry Potter in that category too, but interestingly, Harry Potter also crosses over into urban fantasy because there are werewolves and supernatural creatures, and there is magic in the human world, even though they go through technically the portal at platform 9 3/4 into a magical world. So not every fantasy book is going to sit neatly into a category, but it's trying to realize what categories they might sit in that will probably help you distinguish what you like and what you don't like. And then lastly on this list, but probably not lastly in general, is science fiction. And I know that fantasy and science fiction are often lumped together and they're called SFF. So what I'm getting at here is that fantasy is often imagined and recreated, whereas science fiction is often informed by technology and knowledge we already have, and then that is built on. So for example, we have spaceships, but it will be intergalactic, which obviously we haven't done yet, if we ever do. So fantasy and sci-fi do vary there, but there is an element of crossover, especially in the world building that could go into it with alien species and whatnot, and it becomes a very grand scale, almost fantastical world in space that we haven't experienced yet. But we've experienced technology and computers, so we can kind of relate to what's going on, but obviously, if it's not set on Earth, then it's a little bit hard to relate there too. So that's kind of where they cross over. Knowing how much your brain can handle also really helps and goes a long way with picking out a fantasy read. So mostly, obviously, I read a lot of fantasy and it's my primary genre, but I also branch out of that because often I might just need like a palate cleanser, and so I'll go and pick up a contemporary book and just read that and enjoy it because I don't have to reimagine and understand an entirely new and different world with different languages and cultures and creatures in it. But if you know that you want something complicated, if you know that you want something character driven or single perspective or multiple perspective, then you can kind of start breaking the genre down into bite-sized pieces. So that's really what I wanted to encourage. Also, fantasy is split often into tropes, and you'll probably recognize them when I start talking about them. Some of my favorites are The Chosen One, which is very prolific in Harry Potter. Obviously, Harry Potter is kind of the chosen one with a specific kind of ability, and he's a wizard, and he's got a prophecy, and there's a quest attached to him. So you can kind of get the gist of a main character by thinking, are they the chosen one? Do they have a unique magical ability that they're often born with? Yes or no? And that kind of generally puts them into that category for you. Another one that kind of subverts the chosen one trope that I really like is the unwilling hero or the lovable rogue. And that's when a character doesn't necessarily need to be the hero of their story, but they kind of just end up either in the wrong place or the wrong time, or they just get accosted by something and get dragged into the mystery of it. That's kind of when there is a character that, yeah, they're not the chosen one, the prophecies aren't really about them, but they're there, so they may as well do something about it. And they also have a strong moral justice sense. So if there is something going wrong, they kind of have to get involved. But if it's on a scale of, oh, someone's committing petty theft to, oh, this person might get murdered, They don't worry about the theft because they're a rogue, but if somebody is about to get their life in danger, that's when they step in and save them. So I like that that dynamic adds a bit of a grey area as well, and Harry Dresden will definitely be one of those kinds of characters. He hates it when people get hurt, he has to jump in and help them, and he doesn't really like being the hero, but he will do it anyway because he prefers good over evil, as everyone should, but he's also not a squeaky clean kind of person, so it's interesting to see all of his greys and to see his character growth in the Dresden Files. Two more tropes that I like are the rags to riches trope, and that is generally when an orphan character or a peasant or someone who essentially starts on a farm, doesn't have anything to their name really, they end up having some kind of innate magical ability or a calling, or they go on some kind of quest and then they come to understand their magic, they go through training and they develop a power or a political power or something of that nature. So I like that they start from zero and then they really rough it up and then build to the crescendo of having this complex character. That's what I really like because I like going on that journey with them. Sometimes it's emotional and mental, and oftentimes it's a quest as well. And honestly, I just love me a fantasy quest. And with a fantasy quest comes one of my next favorite tropes, and that is the old mentor. Usually it's the wise old mentor or the mentor, usually like in a Gandalf kind of figure where he guides the hobbits but doesn't directly intervene too often, but he does save lives. I like it when the character isn't too heavy-handed when they're a wise old character. And there is a wise character in the Spellslinger series, and I absolutely adored her because she's not there to make the character of Kellen do things. She's there to mentally and emotionally support him when he needs a shoulder to lean on. And I like that kind of vibe when it comes to a mentor character, because that means it lets the main character breathe and it doesn't push them in a particular direction. They get to choose themselves. So I'm talking about Faru, if I hadn't already said, and I hadn't made that clear, but I really loved her in Spellslinger and I really enjoy her as being the central character in Way of the Argosy as well. And then in addition to all of those things, the different categories, the different tropes, there are way more listed than I can possibly cover in a short video like this, but this is giving you enough to kind of bite off, chew and think about. So you can also go for perspectives, and so perspectives are when it is told in multiple perspective voices or when there is one character that we're reading from. So a couple of single perspective adult fantasy books would be The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, Trade is Blade by Sebastian de Castell, and then also Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. All of them have very different tones and styles of writing, but all of them are told from one character's viewpoint. And then additionally, you've got multitudes of character perspectives in various different books, but the three that I'm going to spotlight here is The Black Prism by Brent Weeks, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, and also The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Some books that I've absolutely adored, and if I have reviews for any of these that I talk about, I'll link them below so you can go and check them out as well. But those are kind of some separations for you, so you can start to get a feeling and an understanding of what you might prefer. So basically, to sum this video up, what you can do is you can go and walk into a bookstore, into the sci-fi fantasy section, and you can usually spot two different kinds of things. I'm being very generalized here, but you can essentially pick out a book that has a figure on it with a sword, and we call that guy with sword. There's often a fantasy quest, there's usually a chosen one, there's a destiny of some kind, or there's magic and mayhem in there. Additionally, there is likely going to be a sci-fi book with a spaceship on it with some kind of quest on the cover. It generally has a close-knit crew and maybe a war in it as well. So those are the two very generalized kinds of things you can find in the sci-fi area, but what I love from these different kinds of stories is not just the way that they're so widespread in their world building and their location settings, whether they're relatable or not. I pick them up because I can still relate to them as a person. All of these characters has something interesting about them that I can get on board with. They all build connections like found family, for example, and a close-knit crew if you're in a spaceship. And those are all things that I really connect with and really enjoy. And because they're not set in the world that I can relate to, it makes all of this experiences very unique and surprising to me. And so what I'm getting at here is that please pick up some of my favorite genres because I want more people to experience them. And if you like quests and you like the idea of fantasy but you're not quite sure where to jump in, then let me know down below. I would love to chat with you. Maybe I can find something that you like. But thank you so much for watching this video. Come and chat with me down below in the comments and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.